I I don't know if Alex is here in the call. He's actually he's in vacation, but he said he might join. Um, but I mean, you get me also, so that's good. So I'm a senior lecturer at Melbourne University. I've been involved in Software Center for a couple of years now. I do both. I mean, I usually develop tools and techniques for software testing, but I also perform empirical studies. I've been working a couple of years ago also in Bombardier Transportation as a tools engineer, and I got my PhD in test automation. And lately, I've been involved in some work related to cognitive aspects of testing. And also ethical aspects of testing. And with Alex, we started maybe last year working on biases in testing. And I think we still have, of course, some gaps, and we're still in our preliminary studies that we plan to do in this field. So I'll just talk for 20 minutes. Well, actually less than that, hopefully, so that we have time for questions. And yes, so what's the purpose of this investigation that we've done? We actually looked at certain type of behaviors. Biases. I mean, biases are hardwired behaviors that usually influence, the human aspects, and they can set the human on an incorrect course of actions. And I mean, while there is evidence that suggests that cognitive biases occur in development tasks, mainly in control lab studies, we still do not know how these biases, affect, for example, testers' everyday behavior. And with such an understanding, it's hard actually to know the extent of the problem. And also the tools and practices in that way would potentially remain inadequate. And in order to close this gap, we investigated the influence of prior beliefs, expectations, preconceptions, or biases on testing. And we also focus on some aspects of test automation, but not. I mean, we could do even better on these aspects, I would say. But we first started by studying the awareness of the industry on this topic. Yes, so the current status is that we surveyed, I think, over 60 practitioners by asking several questions related to these biases. It's quite hard to get people to talk about biases, or that this is our experience. Right now, we have some analysis of the data, but we don't have an in-depth analysis of the data that we collected. And we plan to do more regarding the interviews and open-ended answers that we get. So I think this is a preliminary presentation on this. So talking about the demography of the people that we surveyed, we look at which role are they working in. So we had some developers, QA testers, we had management, and other roles in software development. We looked at also how long these people have worked with testing. So you could see that many of these have 10 plus experience. But of course, we have people that worked between 5 and 10 years, 2 to 5, and a minority actually being new in the jobs working with testing. Yes. So let me. I think Yes. So we wanted to look at to see how much of a concern this is for people working in testing. So we asked them if they have prior beliefs, expectation, preconception, or biases that represent a cause for concern in testing. So you could see that this is definitely a concern for people, and I think it's of course it might be like in some cases a blind spot bias. You have the tendency to see oneself as less biased than other people, or to be able, to identify more cognitive bias in others than in oneself. So you could see that in another question when we refer to when testing, and we ask them about their own judgment and actions, if they're influenced by preconceptional biases. I mean, still, I think there are people that could see this influence, but there are people that, of course, disagree, and they know, I guess, they're aware on some extent. There was some background noise, or sorry, yeah. Maybe I can ask now, but if Alex is joining, maybe he wants to say a couple of words before I go forward, but he might not be in the call.
I can't see him in the list.
He's not in the list.
No.
No, so I'll continue. Yeah, so I said this, that it might be that there is, a case of blind spot bias that we need to actually take into account when investigating awareness, especially if you're asking people about this. And there are limitations of what you can actually do, for example, in a survey or interview, or so we also asked people about when writing a new test case, either test specification or test implementation, do you usually often, modify, adapt an existing test case, or you write it from scratch? This is quite normal. I mean, in many industries, you modify or adapt an existing test suits, but you could see that quite a lot of people don't write them from scratch. But there are still people that, of course, there are needs when you have to write them from scratch. But it's interesting to look at, at these aspects where people use existing knowledge and existing information from previous projects, or from, the reuse maybe the same test values through the test suits. So in many cases, this can happen, and this actually, I think it's in many. This is the default bias when given a choice between several options, you have a tendency to favor the default one. And also maybe this is, of course, related to the IKEA effect, the tendency for people to place, I think, a high value on. I think it's not only on object they partially assemble themselves, such as the furniture from IKEA, regardless of the quality of the end product. So I think these are some results that we should be. I mean, they're interesting to some extent, but they need to be investigated further. I mean, we need to understand how by modifying or adapting an existing test case, how much of a problem, how many problems can arise from that behavior, of course. Yes, when actually we looked also at the automation bias, and looking to see if there is an automation bias present when you rely on automated tools, rather than human cognition. So, for example, when using automated regression tests, we ask them if they usually rely solely on the results of their automated test suits. And I mean, this is very much like a 50-50 here between, I mean, you have people that are using the results directly, or if they don't, they actually they have other ways or of relying on the results. So they need a certain, I mean, they need to talk with certain people, or they need to do something else. Also, when implementing test cases, we ask them that if they perform before or after the implementation a manual test execution. So you could see that many of the respondents actually said yes to that question. So, and also we have 6 participants that they said that they don't implement test cases, but they're involved in testing. Many of them are, I guess, managers. So how about confirmation bias? I mean, this is something that I think it's very much explored in bias literature, and also to some extent in testing. So we asked them that if, besides the regular, test oracles, doesn't matter if the requirements, user stories, or other description, if they use other test approaches to discover, maybe undocumented features, behaviors, maybe exploratory testing. So you could see that many of the responders actually answered yes to this, and additionally they use some other type of testing. They mentioned negative testing, exploratory testing, smoke testing, penetration testing, monkey testing, and other user tests. So they're trying to test some other ideas. And it's interesting to see this. So I think you could see that the people are aware of this, and I think this is good. And maybe I didn't mention it from the beginning, but confirmation bias is the tendency to depend. I mean, you're trying to confirm your own beliefs and your own ideas about, in this case, testing. And in many cases, when you're testing the positive aspects. So it's interesting to see these results, but I think we need to go into more details here. Yes, we looked also on if this question, I think it's about assessing the composition of the test suites with percentage of negative test cases does it contain. I think it's a hard question to answer, and maybe this has been investigated actually in control experiments in many cases with students, but also with industry. But you could see here from our respondents that less than 5%, 11 respondents said that less than 5% of their test suites contain negative test cases. I think quite a lot of the respondents said that I think between 5% and 25% and over 25% of their test suites actually contain negative test cases, which is very much interesting. But we will have to go, of course, into more details. I think we had also a very controversial question where we actually gave an example. So if you'd have to test the date field by writing 3 most valuable test cases, which input data would you consider? I mean, the simple aim of this is recognizing if somebody uses another format. I mean, sometimes you have this curse of knowledge. When you have better informed people, find it actually extremely difficult to think about problems from the perspective of a lesser informed people. And I mean, it can happen, and I mean, it maybe in some cases not their job, or but many users actually would ask additional questions about the context, and I think we got very diverse answers to this. But this is something that we need to investigate further, because the results are not very conclusive. But in many cases, I think the questions were very much into positive test cases, actually. So they offer quite a lot of positive test cases. Yeah, but I mean, we ourselves could be hit by the curse of knowledge bias, and I think we need to take that into account. We looking at maybe for the question with an open-ended answer, we actually perform an initial thematic analysis. So we looked at the questions where we asked participants about for example, encountered biases. So for us in this case, I mean, teams are more, high-level abstractions of the data that we collected. They're basically just pattern responses. They have a meaning. There is a meaning within the responses. So for the question, what kind of prior beliefs, expectation, preconceptions, or biases have they encountered, either themselves or when working with others? We got quite a lot of interesting answers. So respondents actually mentioned several encounter biases that we categorized using the definitions of cognitive biases in the context of software engineering. I think we used Mohanani and his colleagues' definitions. So I would just cover some of them, but I think that it would be interesting to see that when the ownership biases occur when actually practitioners give undue weight to artifacts or even previous beliefs that they themselves create or already possess. So this was something that we saw in the answers. So we had this bias that seems to reduce the potential for other options to be evaluated. For example, preference for their own test case prevents tester from exploring the solution space completely, in a way. And then we have the preconceptions related biases, which are quite many and seem to be present for most respondents. And this refers to the tendency to select actions based on preconceived mental models for the testing task at hand. And these are biases that are causing practitioners to discount, in a way, the exploration required to take certain action. And this could include also confirmation bias and preconceived ideas and opinions about the role of testing and how one should perform it. So we got a lot of those answers, actually. One other type of bias that was quite interesting is the fixation biases, and this bias that refers to focusing on initial assumptions. So this leads to, in a way, reduced awareness of the task and in the context of the task. So for example, some have mentioned the tendency to check if there is a bug in the test framework rather than the code error. So you're just fixating on that because maybe you have experience with that, of course. That doesn't mean it's something bad. Optimism type of biases also have been observed. I mean, I think this reflects this is a set of bias that reflects it leads to false assumptions and premature conclusions. And it can, in the answers that we got, these are regarding efficiency of testing, but also correctness. So this is mostly shown when people over-trust their abilities, or when the likelihood of an outcome is overestimated. Another interesting bias is the convenience bias. And this seems to appear when you have a predisposition to take simplistic routes to certain solutions or testing problems. So for example, there is some tendency to avoid testers and developers during requirement elicitation, and this reduces in a way the effort invested in reasoning and making sense of the information needed for testing, of course. But then there's some problems related to this. And the last one that I want to mention is blissful ignorance. It refers, I think, to in a way to the assumption related to when testers or people in other roles do not pay attention to their surroundings and what happens after testing. So this was something that we have seen in our responses, but I think we would need to finish also the thematic map on this. So, and I think that would be, this might be a bit different, let's say like this. So we wanted to present this ongoing results, because I think it will be good to get also feedback, and maybe some people are interested in this and we can talk. But as future work, we want to investigate both how cognitive biases occur and how these biases impact testing. And I mean, we still do not know how biases affect testers. We know people are aware, but we need to better understand the sources of biases in software testing. I mean, provide this, tangible recommendation, maybe to reduce the effect of cognitive biases, and maybe even implement more effective, even preventive practices, maybe guide tool builders in creating better support. So this is not something we've done, but we keep this as future work. Yeah. So I will think I will stop here, because I think we have 5 minutes, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.